All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to part two of the Enlightenment and the American Revolution. In the last screencast we sort of ended with the Americans winning the American Revolution. Somehow they pulled off this massive upset against the British. In I like sports, so we'll use like a sports analogy. So this would be like Appalachian State beating Michigan or something years ago, which, by the way, should happen all the time. But in this case, the America pulls off the upset, beats Britain with the help of France. But sometimes fighting revolutions are as bloody as they can be and as bad as wars tend to be, they sometimes are easier than securing the peace. So, because then you have to figure out what in the world all of what you just fought for, what did it all mean? And what are you going to do now, kind of thing. So, America wins, but now you have to figure out what's next. I mean, the founding fathers pretty much all believed that we should beat Britain, but they didn't all agree on what the government that came out of the revolution should look like. How democratic should it be? How should the government be structured? There's all these different things that they didn't know the answers to that they had to sort of hash out. And so most of the founding fathers believed in something called Whig principles, which is this notion that a large central government in a place that was disconnected or far away from the people was a bad thing, that a republic on a large scale could not work. And republics had always ultimately failed any time that they had been tried in the history of the world on a small scale. And republics had been sort of had a mixed bag of success, even on a small scale, frankly. And so the idea of like establishing a large scale republic, if you look at the map over here on the right, it is thousands of miles from what is now Maine all the way down to what is now Georgia in the 13 colonies. And so the idea that we were going to have one government that governed all of this land and all of these people, and America is one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse place on the planet at this point. I mean, you have people from all over Europe, and there's all kinds of different religions and different ethnicities and races of people. And how in the world is one government going to be able to govern all of these places? And so Whig principles is the notion that a more localized government was better than a stronger central government that was farther away from the people. This is why a lot of the colonists believed in these town meetings and stuff, especially in New England, where everybody that owned property, which was the vast majority of Americans, they could vote and they could have a say in this. And so they feared a strong central government in a faraway place. I mean, after all, the American Revolution, to some extent, was exactly that. It was a war, it was a conflict against a strong central government in a faraway place that didn't represent them. So why in the world would we expect the American founding fathers then to establish a strong central government in a faraway place? It doesn't make any sense. And so that, of course, leads to the writing of the Articles of Confederation, which was literally that. It said the first line of the charter said something like, "This is a league of friendship and perpetual union," or something like that. And so what the Articles of Confederation does, it represented the beliefs of the founders and the American colonists at the time of the American Revolution, that local government was the government to govern best, and that they didn't really need a strong central government to do much of anything, that it was better to leave government at the level of the people. And so how is a republic, though, when they come together, how is this going to work? And really what they decided was that they looked back and sort of, classic republicanism, sort of this notion that you need educated leaders who are willing to sacrifice their own personal gain and personal ambitions to do what was good for everybody, to do what is good for the average person, the common good. And the founders called this disinterestedness. All right, being disinterested, somebody who didn't have the government shouldn't do land deals that would benefit themselves or something like that. That people needed to be willing to sacrifice their own well-being and their own ambitions to do what was right. And so they believed in this sort of this idea of republicanism. And you're going to find that ultimately the Constitution rejects some of these principles, but at least during the time of the Articles of Confederation, the founders very much believed in this. And so the weakness of the Articles of Confederation ultimately causes a lot of friction between the states and between the people. the states couldn't agree on hardly anything, right? The Articles of Confederation had no ability really to tax. There was no revenue that they could bring in besides like land sales. And so the federal government had almost no ability. So they had the ability to raise an army like they did during the American Revolution, and they had the ability to print money, but that money had no financial backing. You couldn't tax anybody. You couldn't. The states needed 13 out of 13 states to agree on a tax, and I think that happened 0 times during the time of the Articles of Confederation. And so the states couldn't agree on much of anything. And so our foreign policy was weak because it was almost impossible to raise an army because you couldn't pay for it. And so, Britain refused to adhere to the agreement that they had come up with in the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris. They were harassing American merchant ships. They refused to leave the forts near the Great Lakes. The Spanish were inciting Indian violence and stuff in the American Southwest. And there's all these things that America could do very little about in terms of foreign policy. And even some of the states, the states were passing all these laws and stuff that protected debtors, and they got rid of religious qualifications for voting and things like that. And they the constitutions, the state constitutions that were written after the Articles of Confederation was adopted and the American Revolution was over were wildly democratic compared to anything else the world had ever seen. And a lot of the founders sort of feared this, like the idea of like direct democracy to them was kind of like anarchy. And so the Articles of Confederation were weak and they couldn't do much of anything. I think one thing that sort of gets overlooked in American history sometimes is that the Articles are not overly unpopular with the average person. The Articles tended to be unpopular with the more elites, the people you've heard of, the Hamiltons and the Madisons and the Washingtons of the world, the people that lived in commerce and people that lived in, it made sense if you were a merchant like John Hancock in Massachusetts. It made sense if there was some sanity to the tariff policies of all the states and stuff like that. So he was dealing with all of the different states. Just to give you an example of this, like, it was actually more expensive to send goods from New York to Connecticut, which, by the way, they share a border, than it was to send goods from New York to England because the tariffs were lower. So a lot of this was just sort of irrational on the state level. And so what this meant was the founders believed that the average person could not be disinterested, that it was the Enlightenment thinkers, the educated, the more well-off, the more cosmopolitan people that could be disinterested. And part of what they wanted to do was set up a government that would allow their disinterestedness to run the country in a way that was much more benevolent than sort of the insane anarchy as they saw it in some of the states. And so they saw a need for a stronger central government. And so what you end up with, of course, the Constitution. Now, they sit down and they write the Constitution in 1787. There's all these compromises they have to come up with because none of them agree on hardly anything. But you have compromises on representation. This is why you end up with a bicameral legislature, why you end up with a House of Representatives that is basically representative of the people. That was the people's branch. It was the one that, represented all the people equally. And so, and people got to vote for that directly, if the states allowed them to. And then, of course, you have the Senate, which is more of an elitist body that was nominated by the state legislatures and stuff. But they also had to come up with compromises on slavery. The bottom line is the rhetoric of the American Revolution put slavery on the permanent defensive in the United States and really around the world in a lot of cases, because slavery was something that was abhorrent to the rhetoric of the revolution. If people are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then how in the world does slavery fit into that? And there were a lot of founders who talked about that, mostly Northerners. Like John Adams was somebody who thought slavery was abhorrent and it should be stricken from the country at large. But the bottom line is that Southerners saw the American Revolution as protecting property. It was a war to protect property kind of thing. And so they came up with these weird compromises like the 3/5 clause and this fugitive slave clause, and they allowed Congress to ban the international slave trade after 1808. Things like that. But the founders did, sort of put slavery on the permanent defensive through their rhetoric, and of course banning it in the Northwest Territory. And eventually slavery is it's abolished in the North, which sort of puts slavery on the permanent defensive in the South as well. But then, of course, there's other things. You have to, founders believed that their experience with Britain showed them that a strong executive was a bad thing. But then they end up giving the executive branch some, significant powers from the Constitution. Then, of course, checks and balances. This is what was supposed to keep the federal government from being tyrannical. There were still a lot of people in the United States, especially anti-federalists, people that didn't like the idea of a strong central government. Still, those people that believed in Whig principles, they believed that the only way to check the power of a strong central government is to give it checks and balances. So it had to. So one of the things that I think is important to understand about our government is it's sort of created to be inefficient. I mean, that's what checks and balances are. The government, a bill must, pass all these different stages of the lawmaking process in order to actually become law. And so it forces compromise and it forces you to talk these things out. So things tend to not get done like on a whim immediately through the American government unless there's like overwhelming support for it, kind of thing. And we could go on and on about the compromises, but they created what they ultimately came up with was a federal system. We do have a strong central government that's in a faraway place, essentially now, Washington, D.C., but that federal government shares power with states. It shares power with local governments, right? Local governments take care of local things, and states take care of a lot of the things on a more regional level, and then the federal government does some of the overarching things. And another thing the Constitution of the United States does is it takes powers away from states. It limits things like states can't coin money. States are not allowed to conduct their own foreign policy. They're not allowed to restrict trade in any way from other states. There's all these things that the Constitution does to bring some sanity to a system that the founders saw as sort of chaotic and anarchic during this period. And then, of course, the Anti-Federalists argued that the Constitution gave too much power to a strong central government, and it could be tyrannical, and it was dangerous, blah, blah, blah. And so in the end, the Anti-Federalists convinced the Federalists that they would be willing to compromise if they could be guaranteed a Bill of Rights. And so the Bill of Rights ultimately is a compromise. And most of the Federalists thought a Bill of Rights was unnecessary. James Madison, the guy who wrote the Bill of Rights, basically thought the Bill of Rights was a terrible idea because he thought that by throwing out a list of your rights, you could limit your rights. That the government could limit anything that they forgot to write in there. So if you pay very close attention to the Bill of Rights, you look at the Ninth Amendment. I call the Ninth Amendment the cover your butt amendment because basically it says that just because we didn't list it right here doesn't mean you don't have it, kind of thing. So the Ninth Amendment can be interpreted very broadly, but then it said that anything we don't list here is also reserved to the states, kind of thing, and that's the 10th Amendment. And so, the Bill of Rights, the first 8 amendments are there to protect certain rights. I mean, what does it protect? It protects freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and petition and the right to bear arms and trial by jury and protection against double jeopardy and quartering of troops and on and on and on, all the things that they will talk about in class. But what do all those things mean? What does freedom of religion actually mean? Right? What does establishing a religion mean? What does freedom of speech? Does it give you a right to do whatever you want, kind of thing? And of course, the answer to that is no. And so the Bill of Rights is something that we still very much debate and discuss today. And so, but that is a sort of a reaction, a response, and a compromise that was made over the Constitution of the United States. And so let me just wrap this up by saying that America was really if you've ever heard, people call America an experiment, the great experiment in self-government, is because America was really first on the scene, first to adopt a lot of these Enlightenment principles in its government. Some British people might argue with that a little bit, but the bottom line is that those Enlightenment principles, that came from the Scottish and maybe to some extent the French Enlightenment about the consent of the governed and the social contract and all men are created equal and some of these things. America was first in that. We put those things into practice, and the American Revolution in so many ways is, I would argue, is radical. It changes the world in so many ways. Like we now look at democracy as the accepted form of government around the world. We look at free market capitalism and things like that as sort of the accepted economic system around the world. And America was sort of first to go down that road and put these Enlightenment principles into practice. And the thing that makes the American Revolution and our experiment in government radical is the sense that it changes the nature of that relationship between people and their government. Before the American Revolution, people were there to essentially serve the government, right? The government kind of, the government was hereditary. That's why you justified monarchs and bureaucracies and things like that. And the American Revolution said that it should be the opposite, that people should be able to have a say in who their government was and what their government did. And if they didn't like it, they could change it. And they should change it. And so the government was there to serve the people. The government was the people, which is why the Constitution says "we the people" at the top. And so the question then became: is can people govern themselves? Is this experiment in republican government, where Americans govern themselves, where people govern themselves, could it work? Because most Europeans, of course, especially the elites, we were very skeptical that America could pull this off. And they were sort of always waiting on us to fail. And of course, we didn't. In America, ultimately, we've had our ups and downs. We've gotten things right a lot of times. We've gotten things wrong sometimes. But the bottom line is our system has been remarkably stable because it is democratic, and people have a feeling, at least, that they have a say in what goes on and the direction of the country. And the rest of the world sort of came along with that. And so the American Revolution was radical in that sense, that it does change that relationship between what a government's role in our society is supposed to be. So, all right, so that wraps it up, and that is the Enlightenment and the American Revolution. And everybody needs to have a good day.